Welcome to the Epic Success Podcast. I am your host, Dr. Shannon Irvin. Today, episode 300 of the podcast, and I have one of my favorite human beings on the planet, Michael Hyatt, with me today to talk about mind your mindset, the science that shows success starts with your thinking. Community, I know you are aligned with this book. Michael, welcome back to the podcast. I'm so excited to have you.
Thank you for having me on, Shannon.
Okay, I've got to ask, you and I have been friends for a few years. What got you thinking about the science of success? That's near and dear to my heart. So I'd love to hear where this came from, you and of course, Megan as well, as you co-wrote this book.
Well, let me just say that when I looked at my agenda this morning and I saw that you were one of my interviews, I got nervous.
Oh, you're funny.
I thought, okay, now I'm going to be talking to a real brain scientist because that's not me. We did our research.
Yeah.
But I think the thing that happened to me, Shannon, was this was back in the early 2000s. I hired a new executive coach to help me try to grow the company that I was running. So I was the CEO of Thomas Nelson Publishers, large book publishing company, as you know. We were publicly held, and we had grown like crazy. 7 years, consistent growth in profits and earnings and shareholder value and all that stuff. But I was kind of out of tricks. So I hired her, and she said, if you want extraordinary results, if you want to change your results, it's going to require that you change your strategies and your actions.
Yeah.
You're prepared to do that. And I said, yeah, sure. And she said, but even more importantly, there's something that drives those strategies and actions, and that's your thinking. So that if you want to have extraordinary outcomes, the biggest lever that you can pull is to have extraordinary thinking. Everything begins with your thinking.
Yeah.
And so that's what the book was about. And for those that have read my other books, I never presume that, but there's always a mindset component.
Yeah.
And so Megan's my oldest daughter. She's the CEO of our company, Full Focus. But as we were talking about it, we said, this is kind of the prequel to everything else we do. This is the book that if I had to do it all over again, I would have done this book first, and then everything else could have just built on this. So it's that foundational.
Yeah. And because I've been in and around you, your community, Megan, knowing that it has always been a huge focus. Michael coaches me. And so it's been a huge focus for a long, long time. I'm curious. One of the things we say in our community is you are the creator of your thoughts, and your thoughts create your future and your present. So looking around at what you have right now is just a representation of your thoughts. I love that this is a culmination kind of piece or prequel, as you say. I would love for you to talk about, though, as business owners, it's the last thing we tend to look at. Why do you think that is?
I think it's because entrepreneurs, business owners have an action bias.
Amen.
Somebody in your team comes to you with a problem, and what's the first thing you do? You spring into action. You want to fix the problem. You want to solve the issue. You want to answer the question, just an action bias.
Yeah.
And while I think that can be helpful, it's not as helpful as pushing the pause button and asking ourselves the question, what's the story that I'm telling myself right now? So the book is made up of 3 parts. So there's step number 1 is to identify the story. Step number 2 is to interrogate the story. And step number 3 is to imagine a better story.
Yeah.
And so to go through that process, and we have this self-coaching tool in the book that we work through as we go through the book, but to go through that process individually is far more efficient in the long run than simply trying to apply brute force to a problem. We think we got to work faster, work harder, work smarter, and that'll get you so far. But brute force is an exhausting way to work. Part of what we try to teach with our coaching clients, especially, is if you want to achieve more by doing less, you got to think differently.
Yeah. I think we're addicted to the dopamine, to be honest with you. As entrepreneurs, we tend to be, I call them, we're edge dwellers. We love excitement. We love the adrenaline. We love the new, to keep us on task really requires a discipline especially for entrepreneurs. We tend to have that, we solve problems for a living, and, there's always a new problem, and there's always that adrenaline and that dopamine hit, almost, let's just call it what it is, somewhat like an addiction, because it fuels that, oh, I feel good, I made a difference kind of thing,
Yeah.
Yeah. So tell me about this narrator. I love the way, now in our community, we call it the mind matrix, but this narrator, I love that you identified it as this external force that's putting pressure upon you. And so talk a little bit about how the brain tells the story. I'd love to hear this from your perspective.
Yeah, well, from my perspective, a lay perspective, let me underline, is that our brain is made up of billions and billions of cells. In fact, if you take all the neurons in our brain and all the neural connections, you have a neural network that's 10 times as large as the World Wide Web in between your ears.
Yeah, crazy.
So we have these things called concept cells, these neurons where we store bits of information, but our brain is driven to arrange those in stories because we can't live without meaning. And the brain's primary purpose is to keep us safe.
Yeah.
And to predict what's next so it can keep us safe, so that if, we go into that dark forest, a big scary creature might get us. And so the brain's going to keep us from doing that. The problem is the brain sometimes comes to the wrong conclusion. And so these neurons, as they wire together, Hebb's law says as they fire together, they wire together, and you get these neural pathways, these stories that we tell ourselves when a certain trigger happens. It's just a story that's a convenient shorthand that helps us interpret the environment, keep us safe, make decisions about our future. And again, sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. But in our research, we found that up to about 20% of our memories are false, as in didn't happen. 70% of our memories are distorted in some significant way. And so there's this narrator. We just kind of personified it. If this story has a villain, it's the narrator. And so the way I like to think of it, I think this is a good metaphor. But a few weeks ago, as we're recording this, we had the Super Bowl here in the US. So we had this huge football game. And so we had the Chiefs. And who was it else that played? Shows you how soon. Oh, the Eagles.
Eagles. Like thinking.
So shows you how fast you forget those that come in second. But so there was what was happening on the field. Patrick Mahomes threw this pass and it was intercepted, and the Eagles made this touchdown, and the score is this. And so the commentators, those are the facts that are happening on the field. Yeah. Then there's the commentators, two of them, who are telling you what it all means and where the game is going. And that's precisely or similar to what happens inside of our heads. We've got what happens, and the facts can be true or false, but the facts are more like a police report or a lab report. Stick to the facts.
Yeah.
But then the stories that we tell ourselves about the facts can be true or false or true-ish. But we have to hold out for the possibility that the narrator may have it wrong. And the narrator talks inside of our head constantly in our own voice. And we're hearing this interpretation going on all the time. So give you an example. And we talked about this before we started recording, but this last fall, I had a real health scare. So in September, I had a heart attack, which I was shocked.
Yeah.
Because I am so focused on my health and have been for a couple of decades, work out, eat right, have several doctors, takes a village, and all that. But I had a high calcium score. Long story short, had a heart attack, ended up having to have bypass surgery, and then promptly went into cardiac rehab where they monitor the exercise. And there's always an instructional component. So it's part workout, part instruction. So the very first session, I was sitting in the instruction part of this. There was a nurse that was leading it. There were 8 patients, including me. And she says, "What does your heart attack mean?" Okay, fair question, because you could get an array of answers. The guy right across the table from me, the first guy to speak, he said, "Well, here's what it means to me." And he kind of teared up. And he said, "This is the beginning of the end." And he said, I realized that the rest of my life, whatever's left, that I'm past my peak, and that this is going to be just a slide to death.
Oh my.
And it's over. And I thought, wow, that's amazing.
Wow.
Now, my doctor called me in the hospital, and I have a doctor that I see regularly in Los Angeles. So he calls me when I'm in the hospital in Nashville, and he says, look, it's going to be really easy for you to second guess everything that's happened up to this point.
Right.
You're going to think, I should have done this, I could have done that. But he said, forget all that. It's a total waste. It's in the past. What's happened.
Amen.
But here's what we know for sure. You've basically been rebooted.
Wow.
You're getting more blood flow to every part of your body, but particularly to your brain, than you've had in decades.
Huh.
He said, the future is a blank slate. You've been given a new lease on life. He said, I can't wait to see what you're going to create in this next season. So I had the same fact set as the guy sitting across the table from me, but we had two different stories. One of them was given to me as a gift by my doctor. He came up with this on his own. But here's the thing. Those stories shape our behavior.
Yes, they do.
And if you think it's the beginning of the end and there's nothing you can do, that death is inevitable, then, bring on the cheeseburgers, bring on the fried chicken, stop exercising. What difference does it make?
Wow.
So our stories are important.
Stories are so important because that repetition of that thought for that poor person, we know from science, thoughts create emotions, and those thoughts and emotions combine to become a belief. And once belief connects, stores in the subconscious, it's running 90% of your decisions, your actions, and just that is such a beautiful mirror of the beginning of the end versus a reboot and capacity that's unlimited with the same exact event. That's bone chilling, like the thought of that.
It just shows you this power that we have.
Yeah.
And so often we cede, give up to others because for whatever reason, it feels dangerous. So I had another story. I had a executive coach by the name of Eileen. I tell this story in the book, Mind Your Mindset.
Yeah.
But we started working together in the early 2000s. And one of the things that Eileen would do is she would come in once a month to Nashville and sit with me for a full day. Wow. And we would talk through the business. And it was about 75% psychotherapy and about 25% business coaching.
Yeah.
Because she would, lift my cranium and get inside my head and start making adjustments.
Yeah.
So she says to me, this was August of 2009. She comes in, we're in the middle of the recession. And she says, first thing she says is, how did last month turn out? And I said, not very well.
Yeah.
And she said, what? What happened? And I said, well, we missed the top line by about 10%, missed our revenue numbers.
Yeah.
And we were unprofitable. We lost money as a result of that.
Yeah.
And she said, well, I'm really surprised because when I was here last month, you were so confident that you were going to hit your budget and you felt like you had a good shot of exceeding it. So what happened? So I had been preparing for a board meeting, so I'd kind of rehearsed why it had happened already. So I said, well, I would say three reasons. Number one, we're in the middle of an economic recession. So foot traffic at book retail, people going into bookstores, is way down. People don't have the discretionary money. And consumer confidence, lowest ever measured in the history of measuring it.
Yeah.
That's number one. Number two, I'm in an industry that's in upheaval because we're in the process of going from physical books to digital. Nobody knows where that's going to end up. It's kind of chaos right now, to tell you the truth, because we saw what happened to the music industry when Napster came along, and it basically gutted an industry. I had so many friends that lost their jobs here in Nashville in the music industry, or companies that went bankrupt or whatever.
Completely.
So I don't know where that's going. And I said, third, social media. Everything we thought we understood about traditional media, it's not working like it used to, and we haven't quite figured out social media. So our marketing is just we're kind of stuck. And so she said, okay. She said, well, what was it about your leadership that led to these results? I was like incredulous. I was borderline offended.
Yeah.
I said, Eileen, what do you mean? What was it about my leadership This had nothing to do with my leadership. It had everything to do with the macroeconomic environment and the industry and all this stuff.
Yeah.
And she said, yeah, but she said, I get that all those were factors, but what was it about your leadership that led to these results? And I still wasn't getting it. And so she said, okay, let me try it a different way. If you could go back 30 days, knowing what you know now, would you have done something different? And I said, oh, yeah. She said, like what? And I said, well, I would have met with the sales staff in just a short stand-up meeting every day to make sure that they were tracking or pacing toward the budget so that we would hit it, if not exceed it. And if there was a problem, then I could have, intervened and tried to help. She said, great. What else? I said, well, I think I would have gone on those sales calls to Walmart and Target because I think the mere presence of the CEO being there, they probably would have bought more product.
Mm-hmm.
So I gave her like 3 to 5 reasons.
Yeah.
And then she said, so you're telling me it was about your leadership. And I thought, guilty as charged.
Coach. Yeah.
But Shannon, here's the thing. I thought the problem was out there.
Yeah.
It's all this stuff that's external to me. And the good news was that it felt like I was letting myself off the hook.
Sure.
The bad news was I'd made myself the victim.
Yeah.
And that's not exactly being in a position of power where you have any agency to change anything.
Right.
When I accepted responsibility for it, the bad news is I had to take responsibility and say, yeah, this is my fault. This is my result. But once I did that, suddenly the power came back because now I could lead differently. And I did lead differently with different results.
Yeah.
So the thinking is everything.
Thinking is everything. And that epidemic, and I want to dive deeper into the 3 keys, but there is an epidemic in our culture of outside in thinking, of the outside affects the in, of the fear, this is happening, the recession, the housing, the this, the that. And it's not that it's not happening. It's just that it's neutral.
Right.
And for some people, it is actually creating them, multi-billionaires because of the shift, right? So just like when you were in rehab, it's that perspective shift, and nothing like a good coach that takes you and says, let's flip the script here for a second. So your 3 steps, because we know now the brain tells the story and it's based on the past: safety, familiarity, how do I keep you right where you are, right? Which is safe. And you've determined 3: identify, interrogate, imagine. So let's talk about the identify pillar. Like, how do you, in your research and what you and Megan came up with to identify the story? Because as you said, 90% of the story from our memory is completely either false or erroneous. So how do you identify this voice that is governing the show?
Well, I think the first step is just self-awareness, to recognize that there is a story that's running the show.
Yeah.
There is a narrator inside of your head. The narrator usually speaks in sentences. And there's this dialogue that's going on in our head. And oftentimes it feels like a monologue. We don't get a vote often. Yeah. And so I think becoming self-aware of that is really important. I think also in my coaching practice, I often invite my clients to write down, again, when they're frustrated. You don't do this for everything, but when you're frustrated, you're stuck, you want to grow and you can't, whatever it is, that you say, okay, what's the story that you're telling yourself right now?
Yeah.
And to get them to literally write down on paper, what's the narrator saying? Now, what's really fascinating about this is that once we get it out of our head, we can deal with it.
Yes.
When it's in our head, it's bigger and scarier than it needs to be.
Yeah.
So sometimes when I have clients write down the sentences that are in their head, they'll look at it and they will just go, well, that's stupid.
Exactly. That's really dumb. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. I mean, and then sort of like problem solve, like they can self-correct.
Yeah.
Other times you have to just kind of get it down and try to separate the facts from the fiction.
Yes.
So my daughter Megan and her husband Joel, about 10 years ago, adopted 2 little boys from Uganda. They were 4 and 2.
Yeah.
They were not brothers, but they were in the same orphanage. And as when they came home, of course, they were adorable. But when they came home, they began pretty soon to develop some significant behavioral problems.
Sure.
And they had a lack of attachment back when they were in Africa, being in the orphanage, and a lot of people who adopt internationally, this will be a familiar story. Yeah. But this began to manifest itself in severe, and I mean severe behavioral problems. Yeah. They would be punching out kids at school and getting expelled. And I don't know, they went through about 3 different schools each. And
wow.
Megan and Joel sat down and prayerfully and with some fear and concern said, man, if something doesn't happen, these boys are going to end up in prison.
Yeah.
That's the trajectory they're headed on.
Wow.
So Megan, true to form, began to scour the world trying to find a solution.
Yeah.
And so she read that book, The Body Keeps the Score.
Yeah.
And it had a huge impact on it. So she thought, well, maybe I could get with this author. And so she calls the author. The author has a voicemail that says, I'm not doing any more clinical work. Don't leave a message because there's nothing I can do to help you.
Yikes.
Megan says, I'm going to leave a message anyway.
Yeah.
So she tells her whole story.
I love
she
her.
leaves the message. About 2 weeks later, I think it was a lady that wrote the book. I can't remember.
Mm-hmm.
Called her back and said, well, I'm not doing any clinical work, but I want to recommend to you somebody that's in Ohio. And so she did. Wow. And so she began to work with this therapist with the boys. They would go up there pretty regularly. And she did narrative therapy and neurofeedback.
Yeah.
So the first thing she did was she tried to separate the facts from the story. She said, let's talk about the facts, boys. Their story was that Megan and Joel had kidnapped them from their parents, and they had been extracted from the Garden of Eden, which was their home in Uganda, and they had been brought to America against their will. And the whole driving force of their life was to get back to their parents in Africa. Wow. Okay, so that's their story.
Wow.
Now they start interrogating that story, trying to separate the facts from the fiction and interrogate stories number 2.
Yeah.
So the truth was, both of their dads were dead.
Yeah.
Both of the moms were teenage moms that could not support these boys, were totally overwhelmed, and had put up the kids for adoption, praying, hoping to God that they would be adopted by somebody that could give them a better life. Mm. And they lived out in the bush. I mean, they didn't have, anything. Just getting water was a big deal every day.
Yeah.
So they were able to get these facts. They were able to separate the facts from the fiction. They were able to get this down, and they put it, Shannon, on a timeline. Mm. And then she would get the boys to tell the actual story, a different story, what had really happened. They hadn't been kidnapped. They'd been rescued.
Yeah. What a different interpretation.
And so she went through it. And every time they would get together, she would have the boys rehearse the story until it began to cut a new neural pathway.
Yeah.
But amazingly, and I think to all of our surprise, their behavior began to settle down, and neurofeedback was a huge help too.
Yeah.
But now, they're teenagers, so they get into their, the usual mischief.
Yes.
But not anything abnormal. Everything has been normalized, but it took getting the story straight and really interrogating that story so they could come up with a better one.
Yeah. And knowing what I know about Uganda, we've had a charity of our own there for 18 years straight. I would say I started when I was 5. Not true, but that is, it's an intense surrounding. And so even my dissertation was around the post-traumatic stress of orphans, those who have been abandoned. And so it was very common to make up a story about dad coming home and mom coming to rescue. And I'm just in this place. So many of the conversations, I think we talked to 80,000 different children in that scenario for the dissertation itself. And it's almost this protective mechanism. And it allows them to be in horrible circumstances and not just crumble. But yet here they come into a circumstance where they are rescued, and there's almost this big tug of war between the false narrative, the false story that kept them alive, and the story that saved them.
Well,
it's interesting. Yeah.
One of the beautiful things that happened, this was Arlita, the therapist, her recommendation. And so they were able, through the orphanage in Uganda, to get to the parents, to get to the moms.
Wow.
And to get them to come into where the orphanage was and have a Zoom call with Joel, Megan,
wow.
and the boys.
Wow.
And it was the most precious thing. Megan recorded it. And of course, you know, the Ugandans, I mean, they're enormously humble and
very
gracious, but they explained with tears to the boys, to each boy individually, this is like 2 separate calls, what they had done, you know, verified the facts, told them they loved them, and they didn't give them up because there was something wrong with them, which was another part of their story.
Yeah.
You know, and so they kind of vacillate between these 2 stories, but express their love and all this stuff. And it brought, I wouldn't say 100% closure, but real closure, so that the boys knew that the story that Arlita and Joel and Megan were giving him wasn't just made up.
Right.
This was the truth.
Yeah. Wow. So powerful. And I think about people that you and I get the privilege of working with, how these narratives, unchallenged narratives around what they're capable of, their potential, what money is and isn't, what their capacity is, they go unchallenged, just like those stories for those boys went unchallenged until faced with a process to go through and interrogate. I love the word interrogate. We always say in our mind matrix, you know, you're literally putting it on trial, like a lawyer would do, just emotionally, from a logical standpoint and an emotional standpoint, put it on trial. And that part of our brain for the first time gets to see it. Our thinking, cognitive prefrontal cortex gets to see the real story as it is. And you said, most people go, that's ridiculous, you know, but it's like the monster under the bed kind of syndrome. We don't challenge the monster because the monster's always been there. And I want you to dive into the imagine, because I think identifying it and interrogating it, super important. What I'll see a lot of times is like they get to that point, but without this third step, it's kind of the challenge is that it might repeat itself. So how do you train the narrator? What is the imagine step really talking about in terms of telling a different story?
Well, let me give you a couple different strategies.
Okay.
I think the first one is to write a different script.
Yeah.
So if the narrator is saying one thing, and if we're going to take responsibility for our lives and not just be passive and become sort of the directors of this movie, then we can rewrite the script.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's where it has to start. So for example, I can remember listening to a CEO, this is in the book, a CEO speak at an industry event. He was a fellow publishing company CEO. And he got up, and the first thing out of his mouth was, he said, well, I'm not a very gifted speaker. So that was his story, right?
Yeah.
And then he spent the next hour proving it. Because if that's your story, you're not even going to try. You know, why go to the effort to prepare or get better at it? It just is what it is. I had a story myself, and I had to write a different script about public speaking. And as you probably know, public speaking is the biggest fear that people have. They're more afraid of public speaking than death.
Yeah.
And Megan tells her own story about this in the book, which is remarkable. But I had my own version of this. I feared death too.
Yeah.
Feared speaking.
Speaking, yeah.
And so Jerry Seinfeld has this great joke where he says, what that really means, if most people are more fearful of speaking than death, it means that if you're at a funeral, you'd rather be in the casket than giving the eulogy. Oh. Which I thought,
goodness,
was awesome.
No, thank you.
So my experience was that whenever I thought about speaking, it was like I was it was an existential crisis. It was like I was putting my life on the line, and something really, really bad, which was undefined, would happen to me if I failed.
Right.
And so my hands would sweat profusely. My underarms would sweat so much that I would wear 2 t-shirts, just trying to keep myself from sweating through and giving myself away. My mouth would get dry. And I would just, butterflies in my stomach, feel like I'd want to throw up, couldn't sleep at all the night before a speaking engagement. And it was miserable.
Wow.
And so then I had this thought. I thought, okay, that story that I have, first of all, it's completely undefined. I mean, really, what's the worst that can happen?
Right.
So I had to interrogate the story, and then I had to write a different one. And I said, what's happening here is that I'm experiencing the results of adrenaline before I speak.
Yes.
Now, what if adrenaline were a God-given thing to help me perform better? And because when you have adrenaline going through your brain when you take the stage, and this is something we don't often factor for in speech preparation or rehearsal.
Right.
But when you got the adrenaline, it's like a superpower.
Yeah.
Because you will never think more clearly than when you have adrenaline, because your brain's trying to keep you safe. It has to process things very quickly,
super fast,
and come to conclusions very quickly.
Yeah.
And so I began to change my relationship with adrenaline. And so I said, you know what? All this is the body's way, my body's way of preparing me for peak performance.
Yeah.
And so I wrote a different script, and now I welcome it. I spoke this weekend to about 1,000 young adults, and I had all those same experience. I don't get the sweaty hands so much anymore, but I was a little bit nervous, and I thought, oh, this is great. This is an indication that the adrenaline is doing its thing. Yeah. And I'm going to experience some amazing things on stage. I can't wait to see what happens. Wow. Different story, different script.
Different story. Sometimes the stories aren't even your own. So I tell in my community a story about how working with a mentor is so interesting. When you're working with a coach, they get you to think differently. So I was working with a coach, and my business at that time would not get past $200,000. And a lot of people are like, that's a 6-figure business. That's great. But I had a lot bigger aspirations for impact. And so, literally, Michael, 199,900 and something. And I would do something to slow it down every time. And it was maddening. And I couldn't figure out what it was. My mentor at the time really challenged me to go look at the houses that I would be interested in buying when the business passed 7 figures. And it's just like you said, I was fine thinking about it. So the preparation, I was fine driving around the neighborhoods because I'd driven around them a bunch of times in the dreaming phase. And then she had made an appointment with a realtor, and I walked in with a realtor. And it wasn't until I put myself in that position of, oh my gosh, like I've got to have a conversation with this person and they're going to think I'm a fraud. All of a sudden, the entire conversation came out. I could hear my dad's voice, may he rest in peace. He would say, on the backs of good people who make 200,000 or more.
Wow.
And it was like it's clear as day in my mind. And I'm like, oh my gosh, for me, I one of my values in life is to be a good person, to serve, to impact, to make a difference in people's lives. So literally my brain and the story my brain was telling me was putting me in a bind against my core number one value, and I would not pass it. And as soon as I heard that, I was like, well, that's not true, because the more money I make, the more orphans I help. That's just ridiculous. And from that moment on, the business has not stopped growing,
That's
and so
crazy.
Isn't that crazy? And it wasn't even my story to begin with.
Well, yeah, that's so interesting. And, Gay Hendricks, an author, has a book called The Big Leap, and he talks about the upper limit problem.
Yeah.
And it's like a thermostat. You can't go above your thinking. And, if you think that it's bad to make more than $200,000, that thought, and in your case, that belief, subconscious though it may have been, really derails everything else.
Yeah.
Which kind of leads to, let me share another story, or another strategy for imagining a better story. And that's to change your language. I think when it comes to language, most of us think that language is first and foremost the expression of our thinking. And it is. We choose our words based on our desire to express our thinking.
Yeah.
But what we too often don't realize is that there's a reciprocal relationship between language and thinking, so that our language will actually shape our thinking.
Mm-hmm.
So this is, part of the whole discipline of neurolinguistic programming talks about this a lot. But the words I choose, the words I use will shape how I feel and how I think. So for example, if I use catastrophic thinking or catastrophic language, if I say, oh, well, Shannon is a train wreck, well, guess what? That's going to shape my thinking. I'm going to start noticing all the train wrecky things that Shannon does. And I will ignore all the things that don't comport to that sort of that mental image and that word that I've used because it shaped my thinking. So I had an experience one time where I was going to speak in San Diego, one of my favorite places on the planet, maybe my favorite place.
Yeah.
And I'm going to speak there, and I get on the plane, and I had just sat down. We were still parked at the gate. My phone rings, and it's one of my best friends, and he says, "Hey, what's up?" And I said, "Well, I have to go to San Diego to give a speech." And he says, he kind of started laughing. He said, "Did you hear what you just said?" And I said, "Yeah, what?" And he said, you have to go to San Diego. I said, "First of all," he said, "I'm pretty sure nobody held a gun to your head that you made this choice, number one. Number two, San Diego, are you kidding me? Best fish tacos in the world."
In the world.
Climate, what else? And then he said, "And for as long as I've known you, you've really aspired to have this career in public speaking, and now you're going to be speaking to about 1,000 people." And he said, "It seems to me like you don't have to do anything. You get to go to San Diego to speak." So that little verb completely shifted my thinking. And so now whenever I've got something that I'm not particularly excited about, just changing the language of it will oftentimes change my thinking about it and change my experience of it. Yeah. So we have to be careful of those little words. Small hinges swing big doors.
Amen. Amen. And I love that it's almost like the reverse engineering of taking the narrator and creating submission to the vision, to the dreams. It's the idea of like, it starts with the words, and you get to create, we're the creator of our thoughts. And how do we create thoughts? Through language, through words. And so getting excited, getting as passionate about the words that we choose to create the thoughts that we want to think, so that we imagine that different story and keep the repetition of that story going. I'm curious, in your experience, once you shift, tell a different story, start choosing different language, what do you see in terms of the time it takes to shift the narrator, shift the story?
I think a lot of times it depends upon how deeply ingrained it is in our brain.
True.
And I think, to be honest, some people get addicted to their stories.
Yes.
And they're so committed to safety that they will hold on to a debilitating story because maybe it gives them significance. Maybe it's become an organizing principle in their life.
Yeah.
That without, we see this all the time, like take somebody in a family who's an alcoholic. And it may be the spouse who, though they may say they want them sober, is actually the one keeping them from getting sober because there's something they derive from that dysfunction.
Yeah.
So I think we just have to be, what are we getting out of this story? Why does this story persist? And sometimes it persists because there's a secondary effect that we're getting from it.
Yeah.
Some people I don't know why I always meet these people at church at coffee hour, but wherever they are, they just, there always seems to be this drama, all the stuff that's going wrong in their life.
Yeah.
And after a while you start seeing the pattern and you go, I never not know you when you're not going through some kind of drama.
Right.
And it's something they're getting from it. They're getting significance, attention, sense of meaning. So all that to say, in answer to your question, I think it really depends on how much you need that story. Now, I think if you're after something bigger, if you're after a change and you can be self-aware enough about these sort of low-level things you're settling for, then I think you can dislodge it more quickly. But, we don't talk about this in the book, but sometimes it does take, neurofeedback or EMDR or some other modality
Yeah.
to extract yourself from these things. And all those are legit from my perspective.
It's completely legit from my perspective too. And if the story is serving you in some way, and I the way I think about it is like, if the story is serving your significance, it's hard for us to give up significance.
Yes.
And your example of the alcoholic scenario is such a great one, because this person has become their savior in a sense.
Yep.
And that role of savior is creating significance. So like thinking about, is this really creating the future that I want? And if not, the neurofeedback is amazing. EMDR is amazing. One of my colleagues, Dr. Porter, created Brain Tap, which is something you can use that's like, it helps start to dislodge some of these stories from a similar neurofeedback kind of idea. But to me, this is so exciting. And to see you write a book on something that really, like, my life took a right turn to study as well, because literally we are the stories we tell ourselves. And I think God is pretty cool that he gave us the ability to create the life based on the stories that we have, that we have that capacity to create, and that whatever story is governing the processes for us right now isn't the story that has to stay.
That's right.
We can rewrite and tell a different story. Of course, as we wrap up, I want to make sure this book gets into everybody's hands. So we're going to do a contest around it like we always do. We have a special link that we'll put in the show notes. Go in and get your copy of Mind Your Mindset. Such a powerful book. I love Megan's stories in here too. Like the counterpoint between you and Megan is such a powerful dialogue in a way for the brain of an entrepreneur, because of the way you both think yet differently. The stories that you're telling in the book, I think it really brings to life how this process, although it seems like bigger than it is fairly simple to get in, identify, to interrogate, and to start to imagine a different story. I was wondering, Michael, if you would like to leave any additional thoughts, looking in your background, the fact that you're now an avid guitarist, that was a story that you had to decide on. How long ago did you decide to pick up the guitar and become that proficient at it? I'm curious.
Well, that's an interesting story too. I've never told this story until right now, but I started playing guitar in the 9th grade.
Okay.
And, it was just kind of the clique, the group that I got in with, and played in bands and was a music major for 2 years. And then I said, well, then I started telling myself a story. Then I started getting freaked out by the competition at the college where I was going, because it was kind of I had a great music school. It attracted people from all over the world. And I just thought I can't compete at this level. And so I decided to go into philosophy, and so then I kind of laid down the guitar. I would play it kind of recreationally occasionally, and then I got busy with life and kids and all that. So I gave it up. So it really wasn't until about 7 years ago. And for some reason, I thought I didn't even own a guitar. I thought I need to get a guitar.
Yeah.
And so I went with my daughter, Madeline, to a local guitar store, and I sat down, and they kept bringing me guitars to play. And they brought this Martin D28, which won't mean anything to anybody who doesn't play guitar, but for guitar players, it's hanging on the wall behind me.
Yeah.
This was a guitar that I had bought when I was in college. Not this guitar, but I bought a Martin D28, was in college. And when I started playing that guitar in the store, same model, started crying. I didn't know why.
Yeah.
I was just like, it touched something very deeply. And my daughter, Madeline, looked at me and she said, Dad, you found your guitar. You've got to buy this guitar.
Yeah.
So I did. And so, the story changed from I'm afraid of the competition to, hey, I can really just enjoy this for my own benefit. And so I've been taking lessons and trying to get back up to speed and all that, and really loving it.
And you shifted the story from that shaped a part of you. That's so beautiful. I know you and I talked about that at one point in time, about that. I didn't know that whole story. I just knew you took it on and you started becoming you enjoyed it. Like it was part of what gave you therapy. I think you said just it was something that really spoke joy into your life. And I think as we're wrapping up, it's super important for people to think about that for their own lives. Like, what is God putting on your life, on your heart, your calling? What is the thing that if you mind your mindset, literally any of it could happen. And I'm going to challenge Michael. I think the next time you get up to speak, I think getting up and doing like a little, little prequel, little guitar in there would be awesome. We'll have to do that. But I'd love your last thoughts for those who are listening. And I'm going to encourage you, of course, to go buy the book. And we're going to do a special giveaway around the book too, when you send in your receipts. And I'll talk about that once we let Michael finish up.
Well, Shannon, my fundamental belief about life is that it's a gift and that we're stewards of this gift. And so it's our job to take this one life that we've been given, to be good stewards, to develop it, to become all that God has created us to be.
Amen.
And I think that really the secret to doing that is inside of our thinking, inside of our stories. And even if you want to go to a more fundamental level than that, our identities.
Yeah.
Because our identities are made up of those stories and those beliefs and all of that. Bible has a lot to say about that, so much so that people get renamed because that's the only way to change their story.
Yeah.
You think of the Apostle Paul.
Yeah.
He had one history and one story, and his name had to be changed from Saul to Paul so that he could sort of get it into his, body and the rest of him that everything had changed for him. So I think the sky's the limit in terms of what we can accomplish and what we can do when we're willing to, again, identify our stories, interrogate them, and then to imagine a better story.
So good. So glad the two of you went this direction and put this to get into everybody's hands. Such a simple way to explain this, truly the science of success. And Michael, it's always a joy having you on the podcast. I appreciate you so much, my friend.
Thank you, Shannon. I'm grateful you had me on.
All right, that wraps up episode 300 of the Epic Success Podcast. We are going to be giving us a brand new look and really go into this year learning how to be the creator of your thoughts. Now, all of you that are listening, if you don't know, we have a coaching program all around what Michael and I were talking about today called the 67-Day Year. And I want each of you to go buy this book. The link is in the show notes. And I want you to come back in the community and tell me your top takeaway. Now, here's how I want you to do it. We're going to be doing a giveaway now you have to buy Michael's book, but we're going to be doing a really cool giveaway to those that tag Michael, tag me, and tell me your number one takeaway out on social media. I am going to be doing a giveaway pass into our 67-day year program. It's going to be a random drawing, and we're going to give you access to the entire process. So, because here's the thing, you are the creator of your thoughts. Your creator made you a creator. You're creator of your thoughts, and your thoughts create the future that you will have. So choose them wisely. All right. Thank you, Michael. Love you as always. And I'll see you on the next episode of the Epic Success Podcast. Bye for now.